Usually when we think about modern civilization, we picture this, I don't know, this gleaming, highly rational structure.
Right, like a city built on a strict grid.
Exactly. A grid of logic, scientific inquiry, secular governance, all of that. We look down at the concrete under our feet and we just tell ourselves, well, we built this, we figured it all out.
We think we're standing on totally solid modern ground.
Yeah, we really do. And we assume it's this permanent triumph of the Enlightenment, right? Like we've just completely conquered ancient superstition for good.
It's a very comforting narrative, for sure.
But then you start chipping away at that concrete. You dig down just a few inches into our modern politics or our global economy, or honestly, even just our daily habits, like scrolling through our phones.
And that's when the grid disappears.
Right. Suddenly you aren't looking at a modern grid anymore. You realize you are actually standing on the foundation of a temple.
A very old, very deep foundation.
Yeah, you're standing on an altar, and the air is just thick with the smoke of sacrifices that we don't even realize we are making.
Which is a massive paradigm shift for most people to even consider.
It really is. I mean, we operate under this huge assumption that we've completely outgrown ancient theocracies.
But the reality might just be that we've given those theocracies new, highly polished names.
Welcome to the deep dive. For you listening today, we know you are constantly bombarded with information. You want to grasp the really big, sweeping ideas shaping our world, but, well, it is just so easy to feel completely overwhelmed by the noise.
There's just so much noise out there right now.
There really is. So today, our mission is to cut right through that. We are exploring a profound and honestly deeply unsettling critique of modern civilization. It's based on a text called The Corruption of the Faithful.
And it is a fascinating read.
It really is. We're going to map out the author's central argument today, which is that our society is not collapsing from the outside in.
Right. It's not some external force.
Exactly. It isn't war or famine that poses the greatest existential threat to us right now. It's the slow, totally invisible erosion of meaning from the inside out.
The author makes this incredible case that the pillars we thought were liberating us, truth, faith, democracy, capitalism, they've actually mutated.
Mutated into sophisticated systems of total control.
And looking at this text, what stands out immediately is that it spares absolutely no one.
No, it really doesn't.
It takes a very sharp scalpel to highly charged ideologies across the entire political spectrum. It dissects the dogma of the modern left, including neo-Marxism and social justice movements, with the exact same intensity that it dismantles the dogma of the right.
Like nationalism, fascism, extreme free market capitalism.
Exactly.
Which makes this the perfect time to set our ground rules for you listening. We are impartial guides on this deep dive.
Totally impartial.
We are not endorsing any political side here, and we definitely aren't here to tell you who to vote for. We are just simply unpacking the fascinating and sometimes terrifying societal diagnoses presented in this source material.
We just want to hand you the author's map so you can see the landscape for yourself.
Because the core aha moment of this entire text, the thesis that absolutely everything else hinges on, is this idea that we haven't actually become a secular society at all.
Not even a little bit.
No. We have just replaced traditional religions with new invisible theocracies. From the completely opaque algorithm curating the newsfeed on your phone to the stock market dictating the value of human labor, we are still a society governed by fanaticism.
We just conveniently stopped using the word religion to describe it.
Right. Okay, so let's unpack this. To understand how a society quietly replaces its gods, the author says we first have to look at the very foundation of reality itself.
Which is how we interact with truth and how we use language.
Yes. The text introduces this concept called shattered logos. So what exactly is the logos and how did it get shattered?
Well, if we trace it historically and philosophically, the logos is a very ancient concept. In Greek philosophy and early theology, it represented the divine principle of order.
Okay, so like the underlying structure of everything.
Exactly. It was the universal animating principle of reason, meaning, and objective truth. For centuries, whether you anchored that truth in divine scripture, or natural laws discovered by philosophers, or even just a constitutional legal framework, society operated on a shared baseline assumption.
Which was that there is a foundation.
Right. There was a truth out there to be discovered.
Like the laws of physics, right? I mean, gravity exists whether we choose to believe in it or not. The truth is an objective reality, and our job as a society is to just uncover it and align ourselves with it.
That was the operating system of civilization for a very, very long time. But the text argues that this foundational era is entirely over now.
The logos is shattered.
Completely shattered. Truth is no longer viewed as a fixed, objective point waiting to be discovered by reason. Instead, truth is assigned. It's been transformed into a battlefield.
And in this new reality, victory doesn't go to the person who has the actual facts on their side.
No, not at all.
Victory goes to whoever has the power to control perception. The author calls this the war of narratives.
And it's a war that is happening constantly all around us.
This makes me think of, okay, imagine playing a really complex board game with a group of friends. Except the person who is currently winning gets the power to change the definitions of the rules every single time it's their turn.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right, so you're sitting there genuinely trying to play by the rules and figure out the strategy, but the rules just keep shifting right under your feet.
It leaves everyone else at the table completely disoriented.
Yeah, they're so confused that they don't even realize the entire game is fundamentally rigged against them.
That is a brilliant way to visualize the mechanics of what the author is describing here. And the text actually outlines exactly how that bold game is rigged.
It provides what it calls the 3 laws of narrative war.
Right. These laws explain the specific mechanisms by which language is weaponized to control populations.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of that. The first law is the power to name is the power to rule.
This one is huge.
It really is. The author argues that labels are no longer descriptive tools used to understand the world. They're weapons, forged to either elevate your own side or completely erase your opponent.
Because when a person, or a movement, or a historical event can be named and categorized with a specific loaded meaning by those in power, that entity no longer belongs to itself.
It belongs to whoever named it.
Exactly. The text points out that in a narrative war, an action is no longer judged objectively. Think about a protest or a riot.
Oh, yeah, we see this all the time.
Depending entirely on who controls the prevailing narrative, the exact same event is simultaneously labeled an act of righteous democratic resistance by one side.
And an act of treasonous domestic terrorism by the other.
Right. The definition is entirely malleable and it just bends to serve power.
Which leads directly into the second law, and this one really blew my mind because it explains so much about how everyday life feels right now.
Contradiction is strength.
Yes, contradiction is strength. The author argues that cognitive dissonance, forcing people to believe 2 contradictory things at once, or just shifting the foundational beliefs of a society overnight, it isn't a bug in the system.
It's the primary feature.
Right. And we really need to look at the psychological wear and tear this inflicts on you, the citizen.
It's exhausting.
If yesterday's celebrated hero is today's canceled villain, and what was declared undeniable scientific truth this morning is declared dangerous misinformation by nightfall, you just become exhausted.
The system keeps you in a state of constant reactive motion.
Exactly. You never have the time or the mental bandwidth to stop, step back, and reflect on the bigger picture, because the moment you try to figure out the rules of the game, the ground shifts beneath you again.
It is a mechanism of control through sheer psychological fatigue.
And then the third law locks that fatigue into place. Memory is the enemy.
History is no longer treated as an objective record of the past that we can actually learn from.
No, it's treated as a weapon to be wielded in the present.
The past is constantly being rewritten or recontextualized or just scrubbed entirely to serve whatever the current power structure needs you to believe today.
The author draws a very deliberate line here to George Orwell's work, specifically the concept of newspeak from 1984.
Yes. The goal of corrupting language isn't just to censor speech. Censorship is crude,
Yeah.
It creates martyrs.
Right. The true goal is to shrink the available vocabulary to the point where dissenting thought becomes literally impossible to even conceptualize.
If a population no longer has the words to accurately describe oppression or nuance or liberty, they simply cannot organize against a tyrannical system.
Because they can't even talk about it. And if tyranny is successfully rebranded using the language of safety or inclusion or national security, people will actively cheer for the chains that bind them.
And the text doesn't just leave this as some 20th century literary warning. It brings this right into the modern day with artificial intelligence and the tech industry.
Oh man, this part is scary. We aren't just dealing with human politicians spinning stories on television anymore. We are dealing with what the author calls black box gaslighting.
These are incredibly sophisticated algorithms that curate your personal reality.
They filter your news feeds, they hide certain information, and they amplify emotional outrage. but there is zero transparency into the mechanism.
You can't argue with an algorithm because you can't even see the criteria it's using to build the walls of your reality.
Furthermore, AI has the capability to generate synthetic consensus. We're talking about bot networks and deepfakes just flooding the information zone with so much highly plausible fiction.
It causes the average person to suffer an absolute catastrophic loss of faith in the very concept of objective reality. You are left completely adrift.
Wait, hold on a second. I mean, I get the dystopian angle, but let's look at history for a minute. Hasn't political spin and propaganda always existed?
Well, sure.
I mean, emperors in ancient Rome literally carved fake news into marble to flatter themselves and lie to the public about their military victories. Kings have always rewritten history to justify their bloodlines. So why is the shattered logos any different from what humans have always done?
It is a crucial distinction to make. And the text absolutely acknowledges that history. It specifically references Plato's warnings about the sophists in ancient Athens.
Right, the paid tutors.
Exactly. These were tutors who taught wealthy young men how to use rhetoric and emotional manipulation to make the weaker argument look stronger in court or the assembly. They prioritized the power of persuasion completely over the truth.
So the human impulse to manipulate narratives is ancient.
Yes. But what the text argues is entirely unprecedented today is the mechanism of delivery. It is the scale, the speed, and the algorithmic nature of modern media.
I see. So it's the difference between, like, a town crier yelling propaganda in a physical public square where maybe a few hundred people hear it and can immediately debate him,
versus a supercomputer instantly whispering customized, emotionally targeted propaganda into the ears of 3 billion people simultaneously.
Wow. Yeah, that is a terrifying difference.
That is the exact mechanism. The saturation is so total and the delivery is so personalized that our traditional societal truth-finding mechanisms simply cannot catch up.
Because the process of scientific peer review or the slow work of investigative journalism or even just sitting on a porch and having a debate with your neighbor, those things move at human speed.
Right. But the sheer volume of algorithmically manufactured narratives moves at the speed of light.
It creates a post-truth era where we aren't just trying to debunk a few specific lies. We are dealing with an environment perfectly designed to ensure no one even believes a shared truth is possible.
Okay, so if the foundation of truth is shattered today, how did human beings historically anchor themselves? The text provides this really sweeping historical baseline to explain how we transition from divine rulers to secular ideologies.
And that's essential for understanding the trap we're in now.
If we look back at the earliest human civilizations, they universally used the concept of the divine to anchor their reality.
Right. Like in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't just a political leader. He was a divine figure whose primary cosmic duty was upholding Ma'at.
Ma'at was the fundamental principle of order, truth, and justice that kept the universe from falling back into chaos.
And in Mesopotamia, King Hammurabi didn't just write down some good ideas for laws. He claimed his famous legal code was handed directly to him by Shamash, the sun god and god of justice.
Which is the ultimate political trump card, right?
Seriously. I mean, you can't argue with the tax code or the criminal laws because you'd literally be arguing with the sun.
It provided massive societal stability because the rules were cosmic, but it also justified absolute, unquestionable tyranny.
And that dynamic held for thousands of years. Right through the medieval period in Europe, the divine right of kings meant that political power and religious faith were completely intertwined. Faith legitimized the sword.
But then we hit the 16th and 17th centuries and the European wars of religion.
And the continent just tore itself apart.
The bloodshed was so catastrophic that philosophers and early political theorists realized that mixing absolute religious dogma with the power of the state was a recipe for endless apocalyptic slaughter.
Enter the Enlightenment. You have thinkers like John Locke and Voltaire stepping up to the microphone and saying, hey, we have to build a wall. We need a strict separation.
Church stays over here in the private sphere. State operates over here in the public sphere.
They attempt to replace divine, unquestionable rule with reason, with a capital R.
The ambitious goal of the Enlightenment was to anchor human civilization not in the capricious whim of a deity or the bloodline of a king, but in rational thought, observable natural rights, and objective science.
And for a brief historical window, it seems a magnificent liberation of the human mind.
But the text identifies the French Revolution as the ultimate terrifying turning point, where this secular dream revealed a very dark underbelly.
The details of the French Revolution in this text are wild, and they illustrate the author's point perfectly. The most radical of the French revolutionaries didn't just want to politely separate church and state.
No, they wanted to obliterate the Catholic Church entirely.
They actively tried to replace traditional religion with a literal cult of reason. At one point, they actually took a local actress, dressed her up as the goddess of reason, and paraded her through Notre Dame Cathedral.
It sounds almost like satirical performance art to modern ears, but they were deadly serious.
They physically transformed ancient churches into temples of reason.
They completely abolished the Gregorian calendar and created a new, mathematically rational calendar with 10-day weeks just to sever the population's psychological connection to the Christian Sunday.
They were attempting to manufacture a secular religion from scratch overnight.
It makes me think of someone tearing down an oppressive, crumbling old house because they hate the architecture. But then they use the exact same blueprints to build the new house.
Yes, they just swapped the word God on the deed for the word reason, but they moved right back in and kept all the same fanaticism.
And the results were catastrophic. Because what happened almost immediately after they established this cult of reason?
The reign of terror.
Exactly. This utopian, supposedly rational, secular ideology spiraled directly into the reign of terror under Robespierre. Tens of thousands of French citizens were sent to the guillotine.
And they weren't executed for committing actual crimes in a modern sense. They were executed because they were deemed to lack revolutionary virtue. They were treated as heretics who had sinned against the new secular orthodoxy.
The text also points to an earlier example that really solidifies this idea that logic isn't a savior. It looks at the Dutch Golden Age.
Right. This was a society that was a massive hub of rationalism, scientific inquiry, religious tolerance, and booming global commerce.
But that exact same cold, calculated rationalism is what fueled the brutal, dehumanizing efficiency of global colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade.
It demonstrates so clearly that reason and logic are just tools. I mean, a hammer can build a house, or it can crush a skull. Reason does not automatically come with a moral compass.
Which brings us to a profound psychological question that the author presses hard on. What actually happens to the human psyche when you remove God? But the deep evolutionary psychological need for absolute belief remains intact.
Yes, that is the core of it. Are we fundamentally wired for worship? Does human cognition simply demand a religion, meaning that if we don't have a traditional one with a metaphysical God, we will inevitably invent a secular one to fill the void in our brains?
The author makes a very compelling case that the answer is yes.
Wow.
The rapid decline of traditional religious authority in the West created a massive spiritual and psychological void. Human beings desperately need an organizing principle.
We need a narrative that tells us who we are, what the ultimate moral good is, and crucially, who the enemy is.
Right. When traditional faith recedes from the public square, ideology rushes in to fill that exact psychological shape. And this dynamic leads directly to the deadliest phenomena of the 19th and 20th centuries.
The rise of what political scientists call political religions.
Exactly. Let's dig into the mechanics of political religions, because this historical pattern explains so much about the fervor we see in the modern world.
The text argues that this historical hunger for an absolute belief system is the reason why seemingly rational political movements inevitably mutate into full-blown religious cults.
We saw this vividly and tragically in the 20th century. Major movements like communism, fascism, and extreme nationalism did not function merely as political theories regarding the distribution of resources or the organization of government.
They function as totalizing secular faiths.
The text breaks down the architecture of these movements, and it perfectly mirrors theology. Take communism. It had its revered prophets like Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin.
It had its sacred, unquestionable, holy texts like the Communist Manifesto.
It had its eschatology, its vision of the end of the world, which was the future utopia of the stateless, classless society.
And to reach that promised land, the current generation was required to suffer, sacrifice, and purge the non-believers.
Fascism operated with an identical psychological mechanism, but it worshipped different idols. Instead of class, it sacralized the nation or the race.
It had highly choreographed, almost hypnotic liturgies. Think of the torchlit parades, the massive Nuremberg rallies, the architecture designed to make the individual feel small and the state feel infinite.
It demanded unquestionable mystical devotion to the leader as a savior figure. And crucially, both of these political religions were defined by their heretics.
The counter-revolutionaries. The people who had to be purged to keep the body politic pure.
Because when a political platform elevates itself to the level of a religion, Dissent is no longer viewed as a normal, healthy disagreement over policy. Dissent is instantly categorized as blasphemy.
And a policy disagreement can be debated, but blasphemy must be eradicated.
Exactly. So how does this map onto our lives today? Because the text brings this historical pattern right up to the present moment.
Right. It introduces a concept called neo-Marxism in the pulpit. And again, mapping the author's argument here impartially, the text argues that modern ideological movements, particularly those centered around social justice, identity, and cultural purity, function exactly like religions without gods.
They use the exact same psychological hardware.
The structural parallels the author draws are incredibly stark. The text argues that within these modern ideological frameworks, you find a very clear concept of original sin.
This is often framed as inherited privilege, historical guilt, or systemic complicity that an individual is born into and can never fully wash away, regardless of their personal actions.
Then you have a prescribed path to redemption, which takes the form of endless activism, public self-flagellation, and the constant policing of your own thoughts and words.
You have sacraments, which we'll get into more when we talk about capitalism, but they often revolve around what products you boycott, what media you consume, or how you signal your virtue to the in-group on social media.
And you absolutely have heresy, which is any expression of doubt, any request for nuance, or any questioning of the prevailing ideological narrative.
To explain how deeply this affects the individual, the author references Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel Demons, as well as the philosopher Hannah Arendt's seminal work on totalitarianism.
Oh, Hannah Arendt is brilliant on this.
She really is. They explore how these ideologies literally possess the human mind. Arendt noted that under the pressure of totalitarian ideologies, people willingly surrender their independent personal judgment.
They become conditioned to accept absolute contradictions, oscillating wildly between extreme gullibility to the party line and extreme cynicism toward any outside truth.
It operates almost exactly like a computer virus that covertly rewrites a person's underlying operating system.
Once that ideological virus is fully installed, the infected person views every single human interaction, every piece of art, every historical event, and every casual conversation through one hyperspecific, entirely unforgiving lens.
They lose their multidimensionality. They become a machine running a purification program written by someone else.
And the most terrifying consequence of that psychological possession, according to the text, is what it calls the breeding of demons.
In ancient traditional religions, demons were usually viewed as external supernatural spirits trying to tempt you off the righteous path.
But in the modern theology of the masses, the demons are entirely internal to the society.
The system convinces the citizens that they themselves or their neighbors are inherently broken, corrupt, or fundamentally toxic.
The citizens become their own tormentors. They spend their energy hunting down microscopic ideological impurities in their peers and in their own minds.
I want to pause here because I think a lot of people listening might feel their defenses going up.
Yeah, for sure. Aren't modern social justice movements, or, on the flip side of the coin, movements of deep national pride and patriotism, fundamentally rooted in a genuine desire to correct very real historical wrongs?
That's a very valid question.
Aren't people just trying to make the world a safer, more equitable place? Comparing an activist pushing for civil rights or a patriot defending their border to demonic possession seems incredibly extreme.
It is a vital and necessary pushback. And to be clear, the author actually validates the initial human impulse behind these movements. The desire to correct systemic injustice, to protect the vulnerable, or to foster a strong, cohesive community is real, and it is a necessary component of any healthy society.
So it's not the goal that's the problem.
Right. The text critique is not about the goal of justice. It is entirely about the mechanism the movement uses to achieve it.
The danger, the text argues, occurs when these movements cross a very specific line, when they transition from ethical, practical activism into rigid, intolerant dogma.
When a movement begins to demand unquestioning loyalty, when it refuses to allow for basic human fallibility or the possibility of grace.
When it requires the constant public destruction of demons, meaning the cancellation, silencing, or economic ruin of other human beings who step out of line, has ceased to be a movement about justice.
It is mutated into a religion of power and control.
Because the terrifying logic of a movement built entirely on endless purification is that it will inevitably run out of external enemies.
Once the obvious bad guys are gone, the purity tests just get stricter, and the movement starts devouring its own most loyal members.
History proves this time and time again. The revolution does not end when power is successfully seized. The revolution only ends when there is absolutely no one left pure enough to avoid the guillotine.
Let's shift gears. Because if political ideology is one massive, invisible substitute for traditional faith, the text points to a second, perhaps even larger and more pervasive theocracy that every single one of us lives under every day.
The global economy.
The author titles this section "The Parasites of Civilization" and makes a flat-out, uncompromising assertion. Capitalism has become the new god.
This is where the text brilliantly synthesizes theology, sociology, and economics. It argues that we don't just participate in a market, we worship it.
The market is the new church, the shopping mall and the Amazon app are the new cathedrals, and endless consumption is the new daily sacrament.
To explain the historical mechanics of how we actually got here, the author goes back to the early 20th century sociologist Max Weber and his famous concept of the Protestant work ethic.
Can we trace the specific steps of how a deeply religious idea mutated into a soulless capitalist machine?
Weber's analysis is foundational here. He argued that in the early modern era, specifically among Calvinist Protestants, there was a deep theological anxiety.
Calvinists believed in predestination, the idea that God had already decided who was saved and who was damned, and you couldn't change it.
But they believed that intense, disciplined hard work and the resulting material success might be a sign that you were one of the chosen elect.
So they practiced what Weber called worldly asceticism. They didn't take their profits and spend them on lavish luxuries or idle vacations.
No, they worked tirelessly, lived simply, and obsessively reinvested their money back into their enterprises. Their labor was literally a form of desperate prayer.
But over the centuries, as society secularized, the religious fear of hell evaporated.
But the habit of relentless work remained. Weber famously described this tragic irony. He said the Puritan wanted to work in a calling, but modern man is forced to do so.
The religious cloak of meaning was eventually cast aside, but it left behind what Weber called an iron cage.
The massive, complex system of relentless work, extreme efficiency, and endless capital accumulation just kept running on its own momentum.
But it lost its spiritual core. We are all born trapped in that iron cage today, forced to labor our entire lives in a vast, mechanized economic cosmos that no longer serves any higher human purpose.
It just demands to grow, and Karl Marx's critique naturally enters the conversation here, right? Specifically his concept of the disenchantment of the world.
Yes. Despite the text's critique of neo-Marxism, it utilizes Marx's sharp diagnosis of 19th century capitalism. Marx observed that capitalism is a revolutionary force that takes all the warm, organic, human elements of life, family ties, spiritual awe, community bonds, traditional crafts, and aggressively drowns them in what he poetically called the icy water of egotistical calculation.
Everything, absolutely everything, is reduced to a financial transaction.
The worker becomes alienated from the product of their labor, from their peers, and ultimately from their own human nature.
The text updates this for the 21st century by calling it the economy of the soul. The terrifying part of modern capitalism isn't just that you sell your physical labor, it's that your very existence, your internal life, is commodified.
Your identity is no longer something you quietly discover through deep soul-searching or community connection. It's a carefully curated brand that you market on social media to attract followers.
Your attention, the literal cognitive energy of your brain, is treated as an exploitable natural resource mined by tech companies for advertising revenue.
And debt is no longer just a mathematical reality of borrowing money. It is treated by society as a profound moral failing. You owe the system your life, and if you default, you are a bad person.
The author points to the modern phenomenon of spiritual consumerism as the ultimate, inescapable proof of this commodification.
Think about the multi-billion-dollar global wellness industry. Ancient, profound spiritual practices like Buddhist mindfulness or Hindu yoga were originally designed to help individuals detach from material desires, confront suffering, and question the fundamental nature of reality.
But the market absorbs everything. The text actually uses the incredible term mindfulness.
It's a perfect descriptor. The market strips these profound practices of all their deep ethical roots, their moral obligations, and their radical potential.
It repackages the aesthetics of spirituality and sells it back to you as a premium app subscription.
You are sold mindfulness, not to help you reach enlightenment, and certainly not to help you question the brutal injustices of the economic system.
You are sold mindfulness simply to lower your blood pressure and manage your stress levels just enough so you don't burn out,
allowing you to go right back to being a highly productive, uncomplaining cog in the corporate machine on Monday morning. The market god absorbs your genuine human desire for spiritual peace and converts it into a consumable product.
It's a mechanical trap. You feel this deep existential emptiness, which is a normal human reaction to living in the iron cage. So, to fill the void, you go shopping, or you buy a new identity aesthetic, or you doom scroll for emotional outrage to feel alive.
But the more you consume, the emptier you feel.
It's like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. The hunger of the people just perpetually grows, leaving you completely hollowed out.
And we must understand that this hunger is not a flaw in the system. It is the engine. The market god does not want you to achieve lasting satisfaction. A genuinely satisfied citizen stops consuming. The economy relies on your perpetual low-grade misery.
But let me push back on the sheer pessimism of this framing. Isn't it a quantifiable statistical fact that global capitalism has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of absolute grinding poverty over the last century?
That is statistically true, yes.
We have longer lifespans, better medical technology, and access to more information than any humans in history. Can't the free market just be viewed as a highly effective, albeit messy and flawed, tool for resource distribution, rather than framing it as a malevolent, devouring god?
This raises an important question, and the text does not deny the staggering material wealth and technological advancement generated by capitalist systems. But the author's critique hinges on a crucial mechanical distinction.
The difference between a tool and a deity.
Exactly. A tool, like a hammer or a tractor, serves a specific finite purpose to benefit the user. When a house is built or the field is plowed, you put the tool down.
A god, on the other hand, demands infinite, unending devotion and sacrifice.
Capitalism, as it is currently structured through global financialization, is based on the fundamental premise of limitless, infinite compounding growth. But we live on a finite planet with finite ecological resources and finite human cognitive bandwidth.
When an economic system demands infinite growth in a finite reality, it eventually stops building new value and starts extracting existing value.
It transitions from a tool into a parasite. This creates what the text terms the devouring class, a strata of elites, hedge funds, and monopolistic corporations that exist solely to extract wealth, data, and human energy from the working society.
Hollowing out the middle class until the host organism collapses. So they aren't actually building a sustainable civilization anymore. They are just managing the managed decline of the empire, looting the treasury and buying doomsday bunkers on the way out.
That is the bleak reality the author presents. And to keep you, the average citizen, running on this endless consumerist treadmill, and to keep you distracted by fighting in the fabricated war of narratives, the system has to prevent you from doing one incredibly dangerous radical thing.
It has to stop you from finding silence. It has to stop you from thinking.
Precisely. Which brings us to the most intimate section of the text, the dissolution of contemplation.
This part is chilling because it doesn't describe some abstract political theory. It describes what happens when I sit on my couch at night. The author argues that silence, stillness, and deep contemplation are treated by the modern system as literal threats to its survival.
Think about the mechanics of it. If you are truly still, you might begin to reflect on your life. If you reflect deeply, you might begin to question the value of your exhausting job or the anger you feel toward your political rivals.
If you question those things, you might pierce the veil and realize the illusion you're living inside.
Therefore, for the system to maintain control, it must annihilate stillness.
The text describes the world we live in as an architecture of distraction. The endless push notifications vibrating in your pocket, the breaking news alerts screaming in red text, the infinite, frictionless, algorithmic feeds designed by thousands of engineers to hack your dopamine system.
It isn't just annoying. It is explicitly designed to drown your internal monologue in external noise.
You never have a single unmediated moment alone with your own mind to figure out what you actually believe.
And this continuous sensory bombardment leads to what the author calls manufactured confusion. This is a key concept.
In the past, tyrannical regimes maintained control by hiding the truth. They burned books and locked up journalists.
But in the information age, hiding the truth is too difficult. So the strategy flipped. The goal of the modern power structure is to overwhelm you.
They flood the zone with so many conflicting crises, so many contradictory expert opinions, so much synthesized outrage that your brain simply cannot process it all.
You give up. You become passive, exhausted, and intellectually paralyzed.
It's a brilliant, terrible strategy. It's like being trapped inside a sensory overload theme park ride. The strobe lights are flashing, the heavy metal music is blaring, the floor is spinning in circles.
It is so intense and demands so much of your immediate attention, you completely forget there is a quiet, real world outside the building.
You aren't trying to understand the ride. You are just bracing yourself, trying to survive the nausea until it stops. But it never stops. And the text points out the tragic psychological result. We have been successfully trained to fear our own solitude.
We see this everywhere. People instinctively reach for their phones the very second they enter an elevator, or stand in line at the grocery store, or feel a moment of quiet in their living room.
They do this because they are genuinely terrified of the discomfort of unfiltered reality. They are terrified of what anxieties or truths they might have to confront if they actually look inward without a screen mediating the experience.
Let me ask a mechanical question here. Are these social media algorithms truly designed for malicious political control? Or is this just the accidental, tragic fallout of tech companies using A/B testing to maximize user engagement and ad revenue?
Is it a grand conspiracy of control or just amoral capitalism doing its thing?
It is a fair question to ask whether there's a man behind the curtain. But synthesized in the author's argument, the ultimate point is that, practically speaking, the intent almost doesn't matter.
Whether the architecture of distraction is driven by a Silicon Valley corporation seeking to maximize quarterly click revenue, or a political regime actively seeking a compliant populace, the function of the system is identical.
The mechanism acts as a form of control. The end result is exactly the same. The citizens voluntarily surrender their agency, their time, and their capacity for critical thought because they are too tired, too confused, and too distracted to seek the truth.
And this brings us to the climax of the diagnosis. Because when objective reality is fragmented into warring narratives, when your spiritual life is commodified into a product, and when your attention is constantly fractured by an architecture of distraction, what is the ultimate casualty?
It's our system of self-governance. It's democracy itself.
The author offers a bleak, unsparing, and highly controversial diagnosis of our current political reality, calling it theocratic democracy.
In this view, modern democracy in the West has largely ceased to be a genuine functional mechanism for the people to govern themselves. It has been hollowed out.
The institutions remain, but the power is gone. Voting has been reduced to a ritual. It is a highly produced ceremony of obedience that legitimizes the ruling class.
The text uses the phrase inverted tyranny to describe how this works. Classical tyranny is obvious. It's a dictator with an army. Inverted tyranny is subtle.
The author argues that the public is continuously given the illusion of choice through endless, highly dramatized election cycles.
We get to have fierce, screaming partisan debates on cable news. We get to wear the colored hats. We get to put the yard signs in our grass, and we feel incredibly engaged.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The underlying power structure, the corporate lobbyists who write the legislation, the massive financial institutions, the invisible bureaucratic military-industrial complex remains entirely untouched regardless of which party is in office.
You are presented with a false, heavily curated binary. You're allowed to choose which flavor of submission you prefer, or you can choose mindless economic consumption.
But you are not allowed to choose to fundamentally change the structural priorities of the system. The politicians you see arguing on television, the text argues, are no longer true leaders shaping policy.
They're actors playing a role. They are outraged salesmen.
Precisely. Their primary function within the system is to absorb public anger, generate emotional engagement, and provide a distracting, entertaining spectacle, while the true, unelected power apparatus quietly extracts resources and manages the empire behind the scenes.
The analogy that comes to mind is handing a toddler a disconnected video game controller.
Oh man, that hits hard.
The kid is sitting in front of the TV, violently mashing the buttons, leaning into the turns, cheering, getting totally emotionally invested, absolutely convinced they are making the car steer on the screen.
But the actual game is running on a pre-programmed, unchangeable track controlled by the console itself. The toddler's actions have zero effect on the outcome.
It is a deeply sobering analogy, but it perfectly maps onto the text's critique of modern civic participation. The act of voting within this inverted tyranny simply becomes a pacifier.
As long as you believe the plastic controller in your hands actually works, you will keep your eyes on the screen and you will never stand up to unplug the machine.
I have to be honest, I struggle with this level of pessimism. Isn't this just giving up? If we look at history, we have seen grassroots movements affect real, tangible, structural legislative change.
The civil rights movement, the establishment of labor laws, and the weekend, the environmental protections of the 1970s, these weren't illusions. They changed the world.
Is democracy truly dead, or is it just deeply wounded, heavily corrupted, and in desperate need of repair?
The author anticipates that exact reaction. The text clarifies that this incredibly stark diagnosis is not intended to be a funeral dirge for democracy. It is intended to be a brutal wake-up call.
The author posits that this illusion of choice, this inverted tyranny, is actually incredibly fragile. It relies entirely on the complicity and the distraction of the public.
The moment the public realizes the depth of the deception, the moment the toddler realizes the controller is unplugged, the current system instantly loses its power over the mind.
And that necessary, painful realization leads directly into the final and most crucial portion of the text, finding actual solutions.
Thank goodness, because we need a life raft after all of that. The diagnosis of the disease is severe, but the author dedicates the entire final section to a cure. If the foundation is broken, how do we rebuild the shattered logos? How do we reclaim our humanity, our truth, and our civic power?
The text outlines a comprehensive, multifaceted approach for societal renewal. It is very clear that there is no single magic bullet. You cannot just pass one law and fix this.
Rebuilding meaning requires simultaneous, coordinated action across our educational systems, our political structures, our economy, and our own inner psychological lives.
Let's walk through the mechanics of these specific solutions. Step 1 is focused on the very beginning of our deep dive, reclaiming language.
If language is currently being used as a weapon of narrative war, the population needs to be systematically trained to recognize when they are being targeted.
The text heavily emphasizes the absolute necessity of media literacy education, and it highlights Finland as a highly successful, real-world example.
How does Finland actually do it differently?
Finland doesn't just treat media literacy as an elective for college students. They integrate it into their core national school curriculum, starting from a very young age.
10-year-olds in Helsinki are taught in math class how statistics can be easily manipulated to lie. In art class, they are taught how to reverse image search to spot deepfakes, and how the emotional tone of a headline is designed to bypass their critical thinking.
Because of this structural generational training, the Finnish population is remarkably resilient to fake news, foreign disinformation campaigns, and algorithmic manipulation. They have armor.
Furthermore, the text advocates for the creation of deliberative democracy forums. These are structured, citizen-led assemblies where people from vastly different backgrounds are brought together, not to scream slogans at each other for the cameras, but to have moderated, reason-based, long-form dialogues.
The goal is to slowly rebuild the muscle of shared, factual reality.
Step 2 involves the structural mechanics of democratizing power. Taking that disconnected video game controller back, taking it apart, and wiring it directly into the console.
This requires aggressive structural reform to break the grip of inverted tyranny. The text argues that you cannot have a functioning democracy as long as corporate money is legally treated as free speech.
It calls for massive campaign finance reform to get dark money out of politics. It also demands an end to the partisan gerrymandering of electoral districts.
The practice where politicians draw their own district maps to guarantee they never face real threatening competition, which makes them completely unaccountable to voters.
Additionally, it calls for a vast expansion of practical civic education, so citizens actually understand the boring, bureaucratic levers of local power, rather than just focusing on national performative outrage.
Step 3 is tackling the parasite, humanizing the market. If capitalism has mutated into a devouring god that demands infinite growth, how do we forcibly secularize it back into a useful tool?
We have to fundamentally change what we measure, because a society manages what it measures. Currently, we measure success almost entirely by GDP, gross domestic product.
But GDP is a deeply flawed metric for human flourishing. If there is a massive, catastrophic oil spill in the ocean, GDP actually goes up because of all the money spent on the cleanup effort. It measures economic activity, not societal health.
The text points to alternatives like Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index or the OECD's Better Life Index.
These metrics structurally incorporate things like ecological resilience, psychological well-being, access to education, and community vitality alongside raw financial wealth.
If a policy boosts profits but destroys the local community, these indices register it as a failure.
And what about the actual businesses operating within the market?
The author strongly advocates for the expansion of triple bottom-line businesses, such as certified B Corp. These are corporate structures that legally redefine fiduciary duty.
A traditional corporation is legally obligated to maximize shareholder profit above absolutely all other concerns. A B Corp is legally bound to balance profit with a measurable positive impact on their workers, their local community, and the environment.
It rewrites the DNA of the corporation, and crucially, the text insists that we must rebuild robust social safety nets.
That makes total sense because if people are constantly terrified of losing their health care or getting evicted or going bankrupt from a medical emergency, they are trapped in a constant state of physiological survival mode.
You cannot expect someone to be an engaged, contemplative, democratic citizen if they are working 3 gig economy jobs just to keep the lights on.
Exactly. Economic security is not a luxury. It is a fundamental prerequisite for democratic participation.
And finally, step 4 focuses on the individual, restoring contemplation and faith.
This is the necessary antidote to the architecture of distraction. The text argues fiercely for integrating the liberal arts, philosophy, and history back into the center of our educational models.
We need to stop treating schools merely as job training factories for the corporate machine. We need to teach people how to think, how to evaluate a complex argument, and how to understand historical context, not just what to think to pass a standardized test.
It also encourages intentional societal digital detoxes and the active, deliberate carving out of silent, screen-free spaces in our homes and our communities.
And it promotes a mindset the author calls secular humility, as well as genuine interfaith dialogue.
Yes, secular humility is the conscious recognition that your worldview is incomplete. It is the understanding that no single ideology, whether it's a traditional religious dogma or a modern progressive political theory, has a complete monopoly on the absolute truth.
When you actively seek out encounters with people who think fundamentally differently than you, and you listen to them with the intent to understand rather than to conquer, you effectively inoculate yourself against ideological possession.
Looking at all these massive systemic solutions, it makes me think of a generational project of reforestation.
If an entire ancient forest has burned down, you can't just wave a magic wand, pass a law, and expect towering redwood trees to appear overnight.
But you can go out today and start planting individual seeds of critical thought. You can nurture small, localized community connections. You can protect the saplings of truth.
That is a beautiful and highly accurate way to frame the challenge. The text points to the historical example of the progressive era in the United States during the early 1900s.
Society at that time was completely drowning in the corruption of the Gilded Age. You had extreme wealth inequality, monopolistic robber barons controlling the government, and brutal labor conditions. It felt hopeless.
But collective, determined, step-by-step reform from trust-busting to labor laws eventually pushed back the tide. We have successfully broken the grip of corrupt systems before. It is possible.
But I want to bring this down to the ground level. For the person listening to us right now who is maybe driving in their car or folding a pile of laundry or walking their dog, they can't rewrite the tax code today. What is the single most important practical mindset shifts they can make right now to begin resisting this corruption in their own life?
If we distill the entire weight of the author's final message, it points directly to that call for secular humility and the active, defiant creation of stillness.
The most radical act of resistance you can perform today is to tolerate uncertainty. Refuse the easy comfort of the algorithmic echo chamber.
Refuse to demonize your neighbor just because they don't use the exact right ideological vocabulary, and above all, actively choose to step away from the noise.
Put your phone in another room. By creating silence, you reclaim the territory of your own mind from the machine. You carve out a sanctuary where the truth can actually be heard over the shouting.
What an incredible, challenging journey this text takes us on. We've mapped out how the foundational concept of truth was shattered and replaced by a narrative war where language is weaponized.
We've traced the historical line of how ancient faith mutated into the deadly political ideologies that still try to possess us today.
We've examined the iron cage of modern capitalism that tries to commodify our very souls, and we've pulled back the curtain on the performative, distracting illusion of our modern democratic rituals.
This is a heavy, sobering diagnosis. But as we've seen, awareness of the cage is always the first necessary step to breaking the lock.
And to leave our listeners with a final, lingering thought to mull over, I want to bring up one specific, fascinating historical phenomenon that the author details near the end of the text. The Dutch tulip mania.
Oh, this is such a perfect encapsulation of everything we've talked about. Set the scene for this.
It happened in the 1630s, during the height of the Dutch Golden Age, a period defined by immense wealth and supposed rationality. But society suddenly succumbed to an incredible, inexplicable mass delusion.
Tulip bulbs, a relatively new flower introduced to Europe, suddenly became the object of wild, feverish financial speculation.
People legitimately believed that a single rare tulip bulb was worth the equivalent price of a grand multi-story mansion in the center of Amsterdam.
Everyone, from wealthy global merchants to poor chimney sweeps, caught the fever. They traded away their life savings, their land, and their tools for a flower bulb.
It was an illusion sustained entirely by herd mentality and greed. Everyone bought into the narrative because everyone else was shouting that it was true.
Until, one completely unremarkable day in February 1637, they didn't.
The spell broke. The confidence evaporated literally overnight. The bubble crashed, vast fortunes were completely wiped out, and the fundamental trust that bound the society together was deeply fractured for a generation.
The staggering value of the tulips was never real. It was based on absolutely nothing but a shared, manufactured perception that simply collapsed under its own weight.
So as we close out this deep dive, we want to address you, the listener, directly. Look closely at your own life. Look at the political beliefs you hold most fiercely, the ones you are willing to end friendships over.
Look at your financial goals, the products you desperately strive to buy, the aesthetic you try to project.
Look at the anger and the outrage you feel bubbling up when you scroll through the feeds on your screens.
We want you to ponder, what is your modern tulip? What are you valuing or what are you hating simply because the crowd around you is shouting that it is valuable or that it is evil?
It is a difficult question, but it is a question that requires that very silence and that very contemplation that the system works so incredibly hard to steal from you.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to find a genuine moment of silence today. Step away from the noise, ignore the manufactured narratives, and take the time to contemplate your own truth.
You might just find that under all that modern concrete, the foundation of your own mind is still yours to build on.